Hi, everybody. Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 2. My name is Bob Judson, and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. My guest this week is a fellow podcast host, Jonathan Bowman-Perks, who runs the very successful Inspiring Leadership podcast, which is rapidly approaching its 300th episode. Jonathan's got a fascinating career, having started in the Army and built a great career there, but then stepped out and has built an even more successful career out in the private sector, having worked with a number of major companies, including PricewaterhouseCoopers, IBM, Penna, and now running his own very successful leadership business where he does coaching and as I've already mentioned, runs a great podcast. He kindly had me on as a guest on his podcast in the latter part of last year, and it was very evident when we were preparing for that we had a real connection because of our backgrounds. Both our fathers actually died when we were young. His tragically killed in a flying accident, mine dying of natural causes. But beyond that, there's the military piece, there's the leadership piece. There's so many things that we really did connect on. And so when we did this podcast, it was a fascinating conversation, which I really hope you enjoy, because I think there are lots of great leadership nuggets for anyone that is interested in this kind of business and wants to improve their own leadership skills. I think some of the things we have learned along the way might hopefully be useful to you. So really hope you enjoy it. Happy listening, and do let me have some feedback, depending on what you think. Thanks very much. So, Jonathan, welcome. Really great to have you on the podcast as a fellow podcaster. You were kind enough to have me on yours a little while ago, and it's great to reciprocate because I think we had a fantastic conversation then, and I'm really looking forward to what we have now.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bob, because you had such a wealth of experience, tips and techniques, and our journeys are different but similar. And so, yeah, lovely to reciprocate and be back on yours. Thank you for having me on.
No, it's a pleasure. And yeah, you're right. I think the journeys are different but similar, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, because I want to drill into that a little bit, because I think we'll have different perspectives on some things. Much like me, though, you began with a military career, but you've then transitioned, obviously, into the private sector very successfully, and you've been doing that for a long time. I think just to get us started, can you give the listeners just a bit of a flavor of your overall career right from the beginning?
Yeah, I think with any stories, there's a lovely simple technique: then, now, and how. How were things then? How are they now? And how did I get from here to there? And I think if I go back to then, aged 18, arriving at the gates of Sandhurst. My mother meeting the company Sergeant Major Dave Cox, who went on to be Academy Sergeant Major. And he goes, "Thank you, ma'am." I says, "I'll take that. I'm your mother now." In that famous line that they love to use in good guards etiquette, Coldstream Grenadier Guard. And so, yeah, I'd sort of grown up single parent family. My father killed when I was 2.5. We can talk about that another time. One of 3 brothers. And really pretty underconfident, I think, when I first began in life, struggling with, I didn't realize at the time, dyslexia. I probably didn't realize until I was in my late 30s that was the problem. Just thought I was a bit thick. The teacher told me I was thick. I couldn't do my maths. I couldn't spell. And probably did solo sports. I was at boarding school a bit, but then the money ran out. So my mother couldn't afford to keep me there. And so I went to the grammar school in Halifax, or pronounced Halifax when you're from Yorkshire. And that was a bit of a culture shock, from a sort of single-sex boarding school to a co-ed grammar school, where I was the posh one and didn't have a Yorkshire accent because of how we were as a family, but had always grown up in Yorkshire. To then find myself at Sandhurst with people from all walks of life, but suddenly feeling that I'd arrived home, because I was with people I could relate to easily, even though I'd been through Welbeck College, which is the technical arm school, sort of sixth form finishing school for people going into the technical arms of the officer corps in the army. I didn't really find I had anybody who was a bit like me. In fact, they thought I was posh and from a sort of privileged background, even though I grew up in a caravan. So that was sort of all then. getting to Sandhurst. Now, like you, I'm very blessed to meet fascinating people. I spend a lot of my time in America, around Europe, working with CEOs and top teams, offsites, one-to-one coaching, public speaking, and the podcasts have been an absolute joy. I'm on. I think you were talking about you've done about 18 episodes. I've sort of stuck at it, no better than you, but just stuck at it for a number of years and done about 300 now. My wife and I are going to do episode 300 and review what we've learned about those 300 episodes and those 300 people, and many hundreds of thousands of hours of coaching. And I love what I do. I'm living my life on purpose. I'm in my 60s. And I'm consider myself very blessed, but I've been through some highs and lows, and an interesting career in the army. I won't spend long on it, but began in the Royal Corps of Signals, had some fascinating jobs. I did a secondment with the Scots Guards just after the Falklands War. I was a platoon commander with them. So they'd all been to war, my platoon and my colleagues. We were based in Cyprus, which was a great place to be, where I did the mountain marathon and set the world record there. And then things like airborne selection, did that, got my wings and my maroon beret. Almost joined the Scots Guards, almost joined 3 Para, but thought that wasn't really me. But then found home, because I knew I wanted to be in the infantry rather than the signals. Was as a Yorkshireman, was what is now the Yorkshire Regiment, but the Green Howards. So I became, after 10 years, a Green Howards acting major with Richard Dannett, Lord Dannett, as my commanding officer. So great example. Peter Inge, I was his ADC when he was head of the army. Staff College, instructor at Sandhurst, commanding my company, a war armored fighting vehicle company in Bosnia, went to tours in Ireland, counter-terrorism, chief of staff of the Army's largest regional brigade, 15 Northeast Brigade, and then the Army Management Consultancy Services. And someone said to me, "That's not a good career move, Jonathan." I said, no, it is, because I've done my MBA, paid for by the Army, and used it within the Army Management Consultancy Services, and then got a sort of tap on the shoulder from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then moved into PwC. So, and then PwC, IBM, managing director of a PLC called Penna, which is now part of Adecco, which is a huge recruitment kind of group. And but then one of my clients, Deanna, who I'll perhaps talk about later, Deanna Oppenheimer, who was the CEO of Barclays, she said, "Jonathan, we're not hiring your firm, we're hiring you. So why don't you go on your own?" I went, "Oh, no. I've always been in big institutions, big organizations. I couldn't do it on my own. I'm not really very good on my own." Actually, thank God to her. That was, 12, 15 years ago. Best decision ever. And since then, I've been working on my own and with my wife, Lee, who also is a leadership coach as well. And we run a charity which she set up, and she's the CEO of, for the victims of violence against women and girls. So a really rich and full life now, but a lot of learning on the way to get here.
Yeah, amazing variety of things, and there's so much that we can pick over and talk about in there. That's for sure. And it's interesting that go on your own versus under the umbrella of a corporate. When I was leaving the Air Force after longer than you, I did 34 years. So I was then definitely very institutionalized, and I had a couple of friends who were saying to me, "Oh no, you need to, you should think about going on your own and doing a portfolio thing." And I'm going, no, I just haven't got the security for that. I don't feel comfortable in that space. And obviously, after 3.5 years at Deloitte, that's exactly what I did. I went on my own, and like you, I love it. I think it's fantastic to do. But I guess I was grateful for the time at Deloitte, where I had space to build knowledge, get some more commercial experience, and all the rest of it. I think jumping straight into that would have been probably a bit of a step too far.
Yeah, I mean, that's good advice for others who are thinking about that step from serving in the armed forces to going into business. That the armed forces give us amazing skills. Like, they must have invested at least £250,000 in my development, which a friend of mine said, "Well, that was a bit wasted on you, Jonathan, wasn't it?" Thanks, Dave. But when I find a client, you're talking about a program for a year for someone, and it might be £25,000. Oh, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, but they're the CEO of a $60 billion euro business? Are you sure you don't want to develop them? I mean, if you think development's expensive, try the cost of ignorance.
Yeah.
Are you really going to? But they don't. They just throw them in and they go, off you go, be a CEO. And then they go, oh, it hasn't worked out very well. Well, what a surprise. So I think for those who are listening, who've got friends or people they know, or it's for themselves, I found, like you, moving from the army, and luckily I got myself into an army role, army management consultant. So I'm an early adopter. I was using the skills I'd learned on my Open University MBA, which I think took me 2 or 3 years while I was chief of staff of a regional brigade. And that was great to actually apply it in the army, sorting some of the army's problems. And then going into PricewaterhouseCoopers, a bit of a culture shock. Suddenly I was on my own. I didn't have a brigade headquarters to look after. And, I don't know how many, they had sort of 50,000 troops around the Northeast or whatever. I suddenly, it was just me. And you do your own photocopying and you go to your own meeting, and then you're one of a team with a partner, as you saw in Deloitte. But it was a really good grounding. And so I learned a lot in PwC and then IBM, when I was in IBM and in Penna, and particularly running P&L. People don't understand the importance of running a profit and loss account. That's like being in command. You have a P&L. And that you're responsible for the money, for making the money, for winning it. And the armed forces have this terrible snobbishness about, oh, he's in sales. Ugh, I don't want to do anything, but I don't want to do sales. No, we're all in sales. Wake up. You've got to sell a concept, an idea. You've got to sell a product. You've got to believe what you're doing. And I've always found that selling something I believe in worked really well. One time it was quite hard for me was when I was in a management consultancy, which had my bit, which was board and executive coaching, which I sort of set up, management consulting, outplacement, interim, and recruitment. We were always encouraged to cross-sell, but you have to believe in the other people who are selling their product. So, for example, there was only a couple of people in the executive recruitment bit that I trusted enough. The others were just wide boys trying to make a quick buck, and they didn't really care about the clients. And once they'd positioned them, they just dumped them and they forgot about them. But a couple of the others really cared about the whole life cycle of that person and staying with them throughout their career and just checking on them, even though they weren't being paid for it. And working with them, that was fun. I could sell that, but I found I had to believe that the client was getting the best possible service. If they weren't, I found it hard to sell another offering unless you believe in it. I don't know what you found in Deloitte.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and it makes so much sense. I think the long-term relationship piece, as opposed to it being too transactional, is so important in that world. I mean, equally picking up on your running a P&L thing, I think one of the common misconceptions for even quite senior people leaving the military is that you've run a big budget, therefore this commercial thing is going to be relatively straightforward. And actually, of course, it's a completely different thing. I mean, the fact that I was on the Joint Forces Command Board at the end of my career with, I think we had a £3.5 billion budget, but it was a budget. I mean, the object is to spend it, not overspend it, but spend it wisely and do that. But it's not about making money. It's not about turning around and finding ways to enhance what the business does in financial terms. And so, yeah, you're completely different perspective for sure. And again, that's one of the reasons it was really valuable to go to a big corporate and pick up some of those skills, I think, rather than trying to dive in and do it all on my own at the very beginning. Talking of the very beginning, one of the other similarities between us, and you already mentioned it, was that your dad tragically died when you were very young, and as did mine. I mean, mine died of natural causes. Yours was killed, I know. But I'm just interested in motivations. And before you turned up at Sandhurst, no doubt with your ironing board in hand, as everybody must do, what motivated you? How did you prepare to jump into the army and set yourself up?
Yeah, really good question, Bob. And I think it was a sort of an upbringing and a real juxtaposition and paradox of, on the one hand, military service, serve to lead. My father, and people won't see this on the podcast, but there's my father's naval cap, and there's pictures of him climbing into the cockpit of his fast jet that he flew. So he died saving the lives of two other pilots, the one whose aircraft he was test flying and the co-pilot who went with him, who he got out, and he lived, but my father died. So there was all that huge legacy and responsibility in my mother's eyes. For me, the youngest, she wanted Graham to go into the Navy, but my eldest brother, he became the president of the British Plastic Surgeons, so very eminent, and he's still alive, though had a terrible situation, but that's another story, not for today, where he almost was killed by somebody else. And then my other brother, David, has died 2 years ago, sadly, of metastatic cancer. So, but he was never into anything military. Dave did drugs and art. That was his thing. And so I showed an interest in always Captain Commando and magazines about military and daring do, and trying to know more about the father I never knew. And so, he was up on a pedestal, my father. So I sort of thought, how can I be like this mystical, heroic King Arthur kind of figure? And that's what officers do. So I was very motivated to be like him. Not only that, but my uncle was a Navy pilot as well, killed at age 29, flying with the inventor of a brand new helicopter for the forces, where the blades fell off and they plummeted to the ground from a very high altitude, and both died in this huge fireball in Boscombe Down. So that was suddenly a family tragedy. So he died. My father had died in his jet through a fault in manufacturing. British manufacturing of aircraft was poor at the best of times. A bit like in D-Day, if you remember, when the tanks were rolling off the landing ships, the wheels were falling off because they were so badly made. We've never really lost that one. So he was both of them killed by manufacturing faults. Though in those days, you never sued anybody. You just got paid your £10 a month pension, and they go, there you are, well done. Now these days, everybody be suing for millions. But in those days, they didn't do that. They just accepted it, and it was bad luck. And my grandfather, the same. He was inventor for the War Office during the war, flying from the Isle of Man to visit my other uncle, who was a pilot in the RAF, or doing one of the roles in the RAF. And it was his 21st, and he was flying to see him. And the whole aircraft flew into a hillside in the Lake Districts, and everybody on board died, killing my grandfather as well. And then on the other side, my grandfather was in the New Zealand Machine Gun Corps in the First World War. And then we had grandfather George, who was in the Honourable Artillery Company, in A Company of the 1st Battalion. And again, terrible injuries that he sustained in Passchendaele, and never really was quite the same after. So there's all that. But then there was a Quaker side to the family, which is all about peace and not war fighting. But my mother decided rather to become Quaker. She became Church of England by inclination. So there was this belief in service to country and king, queen, whoever it might be at the time, and doing good for others and for the community, which meant that I wanted to go to Sandhurst and be an inspiring leader. But I hadn't had much of a role model because my father wasn't alive. I didn't know how to be the man of the house. So Graham had to grow up quickly. He was about 6 years older than me. He had to grow up and be the man of the house at the age of 9 when his dad was killed. So that's a bit of the story about what motivated him to get me to start my army career. I was very motivated about it. I wanted to be an officer. And then the final thought I had was, my mother, people said to her, when my father was alive, Paul is the top pilot in the Navy. He'd won all sorts of awards. He'd flown at Farnborough with the display team. He was, a pilot of your caliber, Bob. And they said, he's going to be an admiral. Admiral Sir Paul and Lady Perks, they could see it already. Even at the age of 33, he is destined to the top. And suddenly he was dead. But in her mind, she still wanted to be Lady Perks. So she went, when I yawned at table, aged 16, she'd go, Jonathan, generals don't yawn. like as if there was this very repeated pattern of, you're going to be a general one day. Now, I didn't. I became a major and I left and did a different career, which I'm very glad I did. But there was this pressure, subtle pressure, to go for the highest abilities, to serve Queen and country, and potentially to die for your country if need be.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Especially as you've got so much kind of tragedy in the military side, In many ways, I would have thought your mum might have been, no, do anything else. Don't go near the military. So it was quite surprising in some ways that she was pushing you to do that.
Well, one interesting point you say that, Bob. When I was at Sandhurst, aged 18, we had no money. Absolutely. We were poor as church mice. And of course, I was alongside guards officers and cavalry officers who had huge private incomes. And they'd later on invite me to their grouse moors and things like that. But by that stage, I got an army career and a bit of a salary. But at that one, she bought me a little brown Mini, a brand new brown Mini, the one I wanted with wide tires and extensions. It was really cool. I was so cool at 18, having my own car. And I only learned a few years later that she'd said to her best friend, Eve, she said, well, I'm pretty convinced Jonathan will be killed quite early in his life. So I'd like him to have some nice things before he dies.
Good Lord. Wow. Ooh. That's amazing, isn't it?
Because she'd become fatalistic. She'd lost her husband, her brother-in-law, her father-in-law, her own father, but very badly damaged from the trenches and the HAC. He was left for 2 days by Germans attacked him, and they had a fight out in a trench in a shell hole. Everybody was dead but George, and he sort of woke up 2 days later and dragged himself back, having been smacked over the head, and was never quite the same ever since. So she was imagining that although she wanted me to go and be a leader and be an officer, she did expect that I wouldn't live very long.
Wow, fascinating. That really is interesting. Yeah, that's really given me pause for thought, actually, in terms of how she would handle that. Because I was a very good friend of mine who, when we were in the midst of Afghanistan and the bad times in Afghanistan when we were losing quite a lot of people, her son, who's in his late 20s, early 30s now, was at that point was toying with going into the army. And she was saying, please, what can you do? Can you persuade him not to do that? And I remember saying, it's a lady I've known for a very long time. I said, look, why would I do that? I love the military. He's got to plow his own furrow here. Yeah, and of course it's got risk. I mean, everything's got risk. But, if that's what he wants to do, then good for him. It's a great career. But I could see a lot of similar conversations happening with sort of parental gateways into the military at that point, where there was a bit of a view that this is a really, really bad thing to go and do. Not least because it wasn't just the people getting killed, it was all the ones getting injured. And we talked about that off air a little bit beforehand about the scale of injuries that some people have had to endure. And by and large, men, and by and large, very young men, who've then got 40, 50, 60 years of life left, with obviously some pretty traumatic injuries. So I can sort of see why that would play out that way. Change tack slightly, though. You did the army thing. You have gone all the way through to running the Inspiring Leadership podcast. So having done the Inspiring Leader as you're in the military, to then turn that into what you now do. How have you changed, adapted, shaped your leadership style across your career, from military through to commercial, through to running your own thing and doing the coaching you do now?
That's a really good question, Bob. And it's gone a bit of a complete circle. I only think that as you've asked me that. I began in Quaker meeting rooms with my grandmother, and there would be no vicar. It would be sort of self-managed group where people would be moved to say what's on their mind, and no one would interrupt them. No one would assault their thinking. And you'd be interested in what they think, and you'd listen to people intently. And there was a humility and a humanity and an understatement about it. And I end up finding myself now listening and coaching people using the thinking environment designed by Nancy Klein, a Quaker, who came and gave the commencement address at my daughter's head girl year when she was the head girl at the Mount School in New York. And Nancy's had a profound impact on my style of coaching, which is about how far can you go in your thinking before I interrupt you and think for you? And then how much further than that can you go? And then how much further than that can you go in your thinking and your ownership of your own life and your situation, your accountability, and me being your thinking partner to allow you to do your finest thinking and being in dialogue with you, but each of us being interested on building on the other's best thinking. So that's from the start to the finish. But in the middle, age 18, you go into a command and control environment in the military. You and I know from, particularly when you think about it as a pilot in a fast jet in the Royal Air Force, it couldn't be just command and control. You had to think for yourself at speed, incredibly quickly. You had to make a whole series of multiple calculations in your brain, and you lived with the consequence, or you died, as some of your good friends did die, as their aircraft broke apart, or they made a miscalculation and they crashed and died. So there is this unfortunate view that the military is just, you just get told what to do. Of course, when you're doing drill, left turn, right turn, halt, salute, all this kind of stuff, and you had to follow those so that you started to work as one team from this loose collection of disreputable, disinterested, disorganized civilians into a molded group, normally against the instructor and the non-commissioned officer, the captain and the non-commissioned officer, which I then went back to Santos to be that instructor. But that's a story in itself, which was a bit of a revelation for me later on. We can talk about that perhaps. But so there was that early stage of learning command and control and how to organize things and discipline and administration and bureaucracy and timings and discipline and sticking to things and eating your meal within 10 minutes and then being back out in a different form of dress on parade. Why were you doing all that? Well, you understand later on. And now, as you and I rush out, walk the dog, take the wife to the station, and then come back for the podcast, you realize you can achieve all sorts of things very quickly. And it's just second nature. It's just others are all over the place. So went from command and control to then, as I moved into the airborne initiative kind of concept, also armored infantry and mobile infantry operations, where you had to, as you landed on the ground, whatever the rank, if that person saw the enemy, he'd say, take cover. And you wouldn't go, well, do you know, I'm the major here. I'm in charge, because you're just taking a bullet. You just follow the instructions from whoever gave those instructions. So there is this fallacy that the military is just blinded to command and control. They don't think for themselves. It's quite the opposite, much more than in business. This idea, maneuver warfare, airborne initiative, thinking for yourself is paramount. But there is a theme running through about respect, rank, authority, military discipline, and passing judgment on people, things like that, which I saw when I was assistant to the head of the army and some of the decisions that he made. But I was also aware of what was going on in his own life. And I thought, that's interesting. No hypocrisy there. So it was quite interesting to see that full range. Came out, joined PricewaterhouseCoopers and then IBM Business Consulting. And suddenly came across this world of coaching. Now, this must be, goodness now, when I've been out now, about 20, 25 years ago, they were using this technique called coaching. And I went, I've come home. This is great. I love this. You actually are interested in the other person. You're asking them questions. You get them to think for themselves, take ownership. What else? How far can they go in their thinking? And the respecting and listening to a whole group of people and then ultimately making a decision. And so that sort of coach approach to leadership. And now in meeting Stephen Covey and his latest book, which I do love, Trust and Inspire, which I commend to you, Bob, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. It'll be very much coming home for you too. And to those listening, I was with Stephen yesterday in London, and obviously his father did the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If anybody have done development, but if those who haven't, they wouldn't have heard of him. But very, very much someone who changed the whole generation, the way we think about things. And then the speed of trust and trust and inspire. Trust is really high on the agenda now. That giving trust to other people, smart trust, where you not naive. I've been stung badly, lost £300,000 to property fraudsters by over-trusting someone, even though I'd done some due diligence, who was utterly duplicitous and probably a white-collar psychopath, who ended up in jail. The group did get this woman who'd defrauded us all for a few million into jail, but we never got our money back. But you can be naive. You need to be smart in what you trust. But that style of trust and inspire is really completing the loop back to where I first began my life, really.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, actually, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People is my favorite book. I think it's absolutely brilliant. If you've got one book you're going to read, then that's the book I recommend to people, because I think it is so good, and it's great that you got to meet Stephen, because and it's also lovely that he's followed in his father's footsteps to a degree, isn't he?
Yeah,
with doing what he did. So it's that's super. And I think your comments about kind of authoritarian leadership in the military, it's so true. I mean, there's such a strong perspective that, that's what you do. You shout, and therefore people say jump, and it's how high, and there is a place for that. And undeniably there's a place for that. But across all of the services, I think, more and more it's about, inspiration requirement, as opposed to just barking orders at people, because people think they've got brains, they're capable. In many instances, certainly in the Air Force, the people that work for me were more qualified and, educationally more qualified than I was. And these are the people you need to convince to do something, not because they respect you and believe in you, and you've got that kind of right relationship. If you haven't got that, then you're on hiding to nothing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think a build that you'd notice as well is that we must be careful. Language, words create worlds. So the language you use is very important, and with the pair of us now being in business and not in the military, we have to be very careful not to use military language, because it can be too martial, too, grabbing, seizing, beating, holding, all this kind of it's quite violent language if you're not careful.
Very true.
And people get confused between inspiring leaders and charismatic leaders. Now, Donald Trump is charismatic. Lots of people follow him across the whole of America, but he's not inspiring in what I would call inspiring leader, with high trust and reliability and telling the truth and this kind of stuff. He's the antithesis. He's an expiring leader. He draws life out of you, but yet he's charismatic. And so I think you can have people who are very quiet and very unassuming, but they are actually truly inspiring leaders. And often some of the good CEOs that I work with are deeply introverted. And it's quite hard for them to get up there on stage and speak. They don't really want to do it, but they'll do it because that's what's required. And they are inspiring. And they have, strong character and values. Whereas you've got charismatic people like Boris and Liz Truss, who are out there large in the life with great sound bites, like I've just been listening to Empire, which is a great podcast series, and they're talking about the Bolsheviks, and they were dealing with Russian peasants. And so they couldn't read or write. So they used little mantras and little sayings, and so the kulaks are lazy people, and, we must kill them all. And I think you've got to be careful with charismatic people who actually have no substance to them. It's all fluff and image, but behind there, a bit like the Wizard of Oz, there's a little man standing on a wooden platform speaking through a loud hailer. But there's no real substance and sustainability to that. Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think it's really interesting, some of the names you throw in there as well. I mean, as you talked about Donald Trump, what I was thinking about was how interesting it is how that sort of charismatic style of leadership, how far it can take you. I mean, love him or hate him, he has got tens of millions of Americans, ordering hundreds of millions of Americans, I suspect, actually, who are devotees. They think he's fantastic. And that's kind of beyond the first term in office, looking to where he's now going to go. So it is really interesting, isn't it, how no matter whether I'm not a fan. I don't support many of the things he subscribes to, and I think that's very true for a lot of people outside the United States. But he clearly is carrying an awful lot of people with him. And Boris Johnson is another very good example of that, where despite everything, he has still got a huge following of people who would still say we'll have him back tomorrow. Which again, I personally find quite extraordinary, given some of the things that have happened and the things that have gone on, and they're not the Daily Mail story side of this, the stuff that is actually demonstrably true and is evidenced in his behaviour, which is bizarre. So I'm certainly with you that I think you want to be much more in the kind of balance that charisma with the inspiration piece as well to take you there. Talking of people, then, that takes a very neat segue into my next question, actually, is around role models for you. And people that have most impressed you across your career, alive or dead, but I mean, the ones that you really, really resonate with.
Well, might have mentioned before, my dyslexia, which meant that I didn't read very much until later in life when I came across this new invention, the audiobook and the podcast. And I have been hoovering up to catch up with those early years. This fascination with learning about spectrums of history, financial, the crashes in 2008 and things like that, books on that, and the politics of three Ps, post-truth, populism, and polarization. Revenge of Power, a great book by Moses Naam. And so as a dyslexic, I can remember a lot of stuff that I've listened to. And so I was out on the walk with the dog this morning, and I was, listening to another passage, which might be about, exercise with an anthropologist talking about how we were when we squatted as tribesmen and why squatting is good for you and this kind of stuff. And it's a whole range of things from health, well-being and stuff like that. So I've learned a lot from some great leaders like Colin Powell, who my ex-father-in-law lived next door to Colin Powell, my ex-wife. And they all were great friends, and they went round in each other's houses when they were both brigadiers together. So fabulous book. It worked for me in peace and in war, was his great book. It worked for me. So there's people like that. But then the actual people that I served with, I think undoubtedly a psychologist would have a field day with me. And I'll talk perhaps later about doing the Hoffman Institute program, 7-day program, which was life-changing for me and for someone who is a course junkie and has been on every possible course I could do when I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM. And in the army, I was always an early adopter, having done a course. But I was very lucky that I was looking in a way for inspiring leaders who were like my father, or people I could look up to and admire, who have fine qualities of character and trust and integrity and inspiration. And so early in my career, I served with the Scots Guards, and there was General John Kisley, who got a Military Cross on Mount Tumbledown, quite a character. Not right up there with the ones he's a man of a great talent, but also quite a Marmite kind of character. Some loved him, some didn't take to him so much. But then, General Sir Mike Scott and General Ian Mackay-Dick, they were all very fine Scots Guards commanders who'd been in the Falklands War. But then I got this wonderful job as a spy working for GCHQ in 14 Electronic Warfare Signal Regiment, based on the East-West German border, taking my little troop. Great job. I mean, complete independence. Take my troop to go and in the middle of the night with red torches, get ourselves into some forest, set up and start listening to the Russians on the Magdeburg training area with a whole corps of Russian tanks and artillery operating, and then firing missions. One time we came into the forest and we set up within, an hour, and we were starting to listen and interpret what the Russians were doing. And one of the guys moved the cursor because you had to transpose them from Russian to English maps. They weren't the same. Their map system was different. And they moved the cursor over the crosshairs were right over our location. I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a fire mission for a Russian division, sir." I said, "I hope that's not real." He said, No, it's an exercise, but they're letting us know that they know we're here. I said, "We only came in here an hour ago." I said, "Yeah, but they've got their electronic warfare kit and they've got their direction finding." So we were listening on them and they were listening on us. But the commanding officer I had there, who was a truly inspiring leader, still is a good friend of mine, General John Stokoe. And John had served undercover with Special Branch in Northern Ireland, done undercover Special Forces work. He'd been in Malaya in campaigns there where he got malaria, and went on to be sort of Deputy Commander-in-Chief Land, I think. Just fabulous guy, but personable, loved his fitness. He and I loved orienteering. We were into our map reading, and so that was a common bond. But he just inspired me and believed in me. And he'd also done a secondment to the Grenadier Guards as a young officer, where he got in Ireland, and there was a shootout with the IRA and lots of hairy moments for him. He was also tortured by the IRA. The IRA killed his Special Branch operator, took him prisoner, took him across the border into the south and beat him with iron bars for 2 days, shackled naked to the floor. And he was about to die. And he just was praying in a way that the next IRA guy who came into the barn just put a bullet in his brain, because his eye sockets were broken, his limbs were broken. He was just a bloody mess on the floor. But his Grenadier Guards platoon heard about it and completely illegally hired a white van, got across to the far side, released him, killed the IRA terrorist who'd been beating him to death, and brought him home. But He's never quite been the same. He still has flashbacks to horrors he's seen when the IRA had blown up a supermarket and they was trudging through blood and it was all over the walls and things. And it was civilians' bodies that he was walking past. So he's had huge experience and PTSD, but such a father figure and inspiration to me even now. And it was lovely doing some events where I got him to come and share his wisdom and experience with the CEO and boards of different teams I was working with. So he was fabulous, sort of missing father I never had. And the same again with John Griffin when I was adjutant of 2nd Division Signal Regiment, which was a great job in York, and working with people like General Sir Mike Rose, who was our divisional commander, and Murray Naylor, who got me to the Scots Guards. John, ex-SAS, troop commander, again, like John Stoker, John Griffin, very understated, very modest, but boy, you didn't mess with him. I remember there was one very arrogant, big, burly guy, Stevenson, who came in and was just really sort of arrogant and a bit cocky, very clever sort of guy. And John suddenly you could see his eyes flash, and he said, "Don't you ever speak to me like that again, or I will chop you off below the legs." And he suddenly saw this go, "Oh," and he realized that he just overstepped it. But John would get out there, a bit like John Stokoe, who do the escape and evasion exercise we did all the way across Germany. John Stokoe, he got malaria on the first day that we were living in the woods, wet and stuff like that, in tiny bashes. And he said, I said, "The doctor says you're going to come off the exercise." He said, "No, give me a black bin bag. I will sweat this malaria out, and then I'm going on the run with my team of 3 soldiers, because I must lead by example. I'm the commanding officer. I've got to lead by example." And he did. He sweated out for 2 days. He was shivering and shaking with all his malaria. Probably not the right thing to do. But the soldiers loved him because he was going through exactly the same deprivations they were. He went through the resistance to interrogation training because we were prone to capture troops like the SAS, because we were electronic warfare, spying on the Russians. And then John Griffin, the same. If the soldiers went out on a long march, he would do exactly the same, and he would lead by example. So I just think he's a really great guy. The other person I want to call out was Richard Dannett, General the Lord Dannett, Chief of the General Staff, who you probably know.
Yeah, very well.
Richard, great commanding officer, great inspiration. So at a very young age, we knew he was going to be either the head of the army, a bishop, or a politician. And in his own way, he's probably been all 3. But we knew that when he was a young lieutenant colonel. And he gave me the screen company as a young acting, I don't know, how old was I, 37-year-old or something. He promoted me to a major. He said, "You've got this mobile screen company with the mortars and the anti-tank and the recce troop. Do as you wish, design it, make it interesting." So believed in me. And also at the same time, he could challenge me. He goes, "Jonathan, you're a bit too intense with your peer group. You don't need to compete against them so much." Well, actually, you did in the battalion like that, because they'd all worked out who was going to be the commanding officer. And I transferred into them late in the day and upset a lot of people who saw their natural place as commanding officer in the pecking order. And suddenly there's this new joiner who'd come from being an instructor at Santos. Who did he think he was? Wasn't a proper greenhound. He hadn't been there from the beginning since birth. And so Richard spotted that and tried to make life easier. But he's remained a friend since, and he was on episode 200. We're about to do episode 300. And then finally switching from those 3 men in the military to in business, Deanna Oppenheimer, the CEO of Barclays Retail Bank and then Barclays Europe. Great, inspiring woman. I even got my daughters to do some work experience with members of Barclays when they were in their about 18 years old. And they just noticed the respect and the charisma that she had, general charisma as well as inspiration, when she came into the room. And she in turn introduced me to her nephew, Matt Oppenheimer, who's probably one of the finest CEOs I work with, and along with Srini Gopalan, who's the CEO of Deutsche Telekom in Germany. But Matt's the CEO of Remitly Global, who look after immigrants who are sending money back to their loved ones. And he's created in 11 years from nothing with his co-founder, Josh, a $5 billion business with people all over the world, and truly learning leader who's prepared and has the humility to learn and grow. So some great people.
Yeah, fantastic examples. I think that leading by example thing, not that I'm necessarily advocating the sweat out the malaria and carry on persisting through what was clearly quite a challenging time, but I think the general principle of leading by example is a really, really important one. And I think the learning leader thing as well, I think it is another one that I've seen so often demonstrated positively and also negatively, where people think they've got nothing else to learn, or they've done all this before, and they're not prepared to listen or even hear the views of others in the room. And I think that's one of the skills that good leaders definitely need to develop, is to be able to understand the character types of the people they've got there and leverage the best out of them, even if they're quite different to them. And particularly, I think if you are a reasonably, I suppose, gregarious, outgoing, punchy, extrovert type of leader, that's harder to do, because inevitably you have to rein yourself back in very significantly in order to turn around and get to the introverts who are, sat the other side of the table from you potentially. But it's a critical area to develop.
You're exactly right, Bob. And I was thinking when you talked about the learning leader and those who don't think they have more to learn, it was a very good Harvard Business School article, but the three things I took away from it were three great questions to ask any leader, which is to check if they've got the three hums. They didn't talk about this. The three hums come from Professor Roger Steer, who was a visiting professor like I was at Cass, now London City University. But the three hums are humility, humanity, and humor, very important in leaders. And the test of whether they have that is question one is, when was the last time you personally were dead wrong? Completely wrong. You got it wrong. When was the last time? Now, hopefully you get the kind of leaders that I respect and admire. I go, Jonathan, frequently, every day, I make mistakes. And I try and rectify them as soon as I realize. The ones that worry me, like one did, well, no, I really find it a problem to think of a time I was wrong. It could have been 1986, but that really wasn't my fault. It was somebody else. But I suppose I could take a bit of the blame for that. And so you got a problem there. Question two: how quickly did you realize you were wrong and rectify the situation? That's always an interesting one. And the third one is, how quickly did you make amends with those that you'd caused problems for? And did you apologize for being wrong or mistreating people, whatever it might be? And again, that's interesting. What you mean I don't apologize. That shows weakness. I just keep going. Keep going. Don't never look back. Keep looking forward. Don't be looking in the rearview mirror. You just got to get on. And that worries me as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think I totally get everything you've just said. I do think, though, there is an important element of, I talked about forks in the road on, it's either on a podcast or a LinkedIn post recently, where, for me at least, once I've made a decision, I'm going down a particular fork in the road, I try to be no regrets. I don't want to go back and look back and wish I'd done something differently and go for the what ifing and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I totally get what you're saying, that if you've made a mistake and it's actually something you should actually look to make amends for, then absolutely admitting it and going back and apologizing for it and taking the right people back with you is really important. And you get huge amounts of respect for that as well. Every time I've done that, I found that people are often surprised, and generally the long-term benefit of that is massive. If you're genuinely have got enough humility to know that you're not always right, and you won't be. I mean, who can be? It's impossible to be in that place
unless you're Donald. Donald's never wrong.
Yeah, I think pretty much he's always right.
Trust, actually, she's coming back and telling us it was not her fault at all that the economy crashed, and everybody's mortgages have gone up. It was nothing to do with her.
It's a peculiar trait of
blob,
politicians, isn't it?
The blob, that's the excuse.
Yeah.
The civil service blob that are out to get them.
I think it is an interesting trait of politicians, isn't it? That is unfortunate because often you see, on radio interviews is a good example, or TV interviews, where they just refuse to answer the question, and that really winds me up. And I actually think it's very detrimental to their own, the image they create of themselves, especially when you're effectively asking them, what did you have for breakfast this morning? But that's not the point. This is what I want to talk about. Well, hang on. It's crazy to do that. You might as well just turn around and not be on the interview, unless if you're going to have such a vehement opposition to having a sensible conversation about something. But it is oddly a very political trait, sadly.
Yeah, and they're so different from people like you'd probably know another one, General Sir Rupert Smith, who I had on my early podcast. And I talked to him about, often people look for the great man or the great woman who knows everything. He said, no, quite the opposite. He said, I remember going to a big shape when he was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander briefing room. And they went, "Oh, General, you're here. What do you think about this?" And he sat back in one of the chairs at the back of the auditorium and put his feet up on the guys. He said, "I haven't got a clue. What do you think?" I don't know. I haven't got a view on that yet, but tell me more. And I think that kind of, it's okay not to know. And people expect the poorer leaders that I've come across, who are the micromanagers, who do not do the trust and inspire. They do the command and control. They expect to go in a deep dive and everything about everything. It's not good.
I totally agree. And one of the other interesting traits that I think is indicative of good leadership is where you actually think you might have strong views on something. You might have a lot of ideas about how you want something to be done, but you're going into a room full of, or with a bunch of people who you want to tap into their knowledge. Actually, the classic, and I said it on your podcast, it's the you've got two ears and one mouth, use them in proportion, and listening first and then talking is such an important thing to do, because if you don't do that and you go in as a leader, and particularly if you're a relatively strong authoritarian style of leader or perceived as that way, then of course you just shut the room down, because people will go, well, I'm not interested. He's not interested in my views. Where actually what you want to do is you want to cultivate their views and then turn around and add those to the mix and then choose the best path ahead. And if you don't listen first and you don't listen, effectively to what's being said, and you've kind of preordained the outcome, then it's a horrendous trait to have, I think, in a leadership role.
Yeah, it's called the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. And if the hippo goes first, everybody else follows him or her, and they all agree with the hippo. So the hippo must go last and listen to everybody else.
Love it. Yeah, I've not heard that. That's good. On traits, leadership traits, let's just drill into that a little bit. So you've got a huge amount of experience of looking at people here. What traits do you think are the most important? Not just things that are important for you personally, but things that you look for in others.
Yeah. Well, of course, language is so important on this particular topic. I've qualified in many psychometrics. Again, part of my sort of being a course junkie is to get overqualified in every possible thing to do with leadership and coaching and psychometrics. But in all the different psychometrics I came across, and of course my wife and I have designed our own psychometric now, the Inspiring Leadership Psychometric, which sort of assesses an individual, then looks at the team, and then you get 360. We found from the research that we did with a wonderful man, Dr. Reuven Bar-On, who designed the EQI, the Emotional Quotient Inventory. Reuven fought in 5 Arab-Israeli wars, and now that's more pertinent than ever, isn't it? And saw a lot of battle shock and things like that. And he's Reuven's still alive and a real character and great friend of ours. And we were really interested in what makes high-performing leaders, what makes inspiring leaders, how do we know high-performing leaders and teams, what kind of qualities. So we used a compass with a sort of North Star for integrity, which is the moral compass is a very key part of it. And then 7 other components, which is a bit like a Norman church. If you notice, have 3 keystones, the main one and the 2 side ones, the main one being at the northern point, top of the arch, is that MQ, moral intelligence quotient, how people can know what you stand for and what you won't fall for. But then to the left of that is legacy, stewardship, legacy, leaving things better than you found them. And then to the right of that, this concept of your purpose quotient, your spiritual quotient, some people call it, but what gives your life meaning and purpose? You know, the two most important days in your life, Mark Twain said, was the day you were born and the day you found out why. I found out why when I met my father's fellow pilots, including the man who'd lived when my father had died. And that's a whole story in itself for another day. But the point was, that was the moment I found my meaning and purpose in my life. And I've been living a very purposeful life, living my life on purpose since then. So those three, I think, are foundational to a successful leader and principles that I try and aspire to live myself and know when I come unstuck and when I get back on track. And then the other ones, one that often not in many leadership models, but should be, health quotient. You and I were talking earlier about people with PTSD and medical discharges and things like that, but looking after your mental and your physical health, those are very key topics. And I work very hard, as I did this morning before this podcast, working in zone 2 on my indoor cycle, taking up the front wheel and sticking it on a roller, whatever the weather and the rainstorms outside. After the dog walk, I could then do some zone 2 training. And I've got a personal trainer and I have a set diet and that kind of stuff. So health is very important. Next one round is emotional intelligence. So, it's IQ accounts for 5% of people's success, whereas EQ accounts for 30% of people's success. So emotional and social intelligence, reading the room, reading other people, reading yourself, reading what's going on in your company. And then sort of CQ, which is sort of cultural intelligence, this team, picking out what's going on in the team, the culture, the diversity, equality, inclusion, that whole area is in there. Resilience is such an important one, but not overdoing the resilience so it actually affects your health and your health goes down because you're just being stubborn and keeping going. And then the final of the 8 that I find so useful is brand, reputation, image, and BQ. So what do people say about you, Bob Judson, when you're not in the room? That's your brand, not what you'd like it to be.
No, I use exactly that expression quite a lot when I do facilitation for the likes of Deloitte University and things where we talk about personal brand, because it is a concept that actually a lot of people don't get. That they don't recognize that actually, you have one, whether you purposefully build it, which is what you should be doing, or if you don't, then you have one anyway, because it is exactly that is what people are talking about you when you're not there, and so trying to make sure you shape that in the direction that's useful to you is clearly very important.
Yeah. No, so those are, there's many out there. There's thousands upon thousands of models, but I find that compass is quite a useful way of just checking in with yourself and checking with the team, and finding when you're overdoing, because you can over-index on certain things, and so you can be over-resilient, and then you're sort of stubborn, and you might end up dying on Mount Everest because you should have turned back at 3:00. But you're going, no, I'm going to push on and it might get there by 5. Great, you've got to the summit, but you've got to get back down to the next camp.
Yeah,
and that's when Into Thin Air, which was John Krakauer's book, so many died that year, I think 8. And actually, Harry Buddha-Magar, who I interviewed with, who lost his legs above the knees to an IED, he said this year, 17 people died because they over-indexed on that. They had, obsessive summit fever. They were going for the goal. They forget that it's only a part of the success is getting them back down. It's not even half of it. It's about a third of it. 2/3 of it's coming back down.
No, I think Everest is always going to generate some of those specific, very interesting challenges, isn't it? Around how far people push and how many people are even on the mountain, and what's common sense. What's the commercial element of this versus common sense reality, which I think is is a really interesting, difficult area to manage. And that's a great model. I mean, I like your compass model. I think it's a good way of doing it. And I think importantly, I mean, you mentioned it, the sort of work-life balance element of this, which is something I think a lot of leaders are not as good at as they should be. And they don't necessarily until quite late in life recognize that. They don't think about, they think they're immortal. They think they can just push on regardless. And of course, they forget 2 things. One is they can't. And 2 is actually that's the example they're setting for everyone else. which I think is equally detrimental. I mean, if I've seen people, as you will have done as well, and particularly in the military world, where they were without doubt workaholics. They were very, very driven, and they were very competent and extremely good at what they did. But the pressure that put on their staff, if they had people working directly for them in sort of immediate outer office type environment, and also the example they set was one that you kind of go, do you really want that to be the example you set? And I think if you sit back and think about that and look at A, what it's doing to your own well-being, and B, what kind of long-term impression and legacy, which is another word you used a minute ago, you're leaving. I think it is important for people to turn around and connect with themselves on that and go, what should I be doing here, to try and make sure that I'm not setting that wrong example, because certainly in my experience, one of the things that has definitely shaped me is recognizing that people have very long memories. You can, if you give a bad impression to someone, and it can be completely unintentional. It can be something you just didn't even think about, but just because you were kind of in the moment, you were very focused, angry, frustrated by something else that was affecting your personal mood, and you project that in a way that's unfortunate onto somebody else. Then that's the impression quite often that they're left with of you. And it's the age-old thing, isn't it? You never get a second chance to make a first impression, which is really difficult.
Very true. Very true.
And leveraging that just a little bit, you've done so much coaching and podcast work, as you said. 300, I bow in respect, 300 podcasts. That's amazing when I'm on kind of 18. What do you think you've learned yourself, though, about all the people you've engaged with, and what have you taken from that? How's that shaped your own approach to what you do and in work and kind of life in general from all those different coaching and podcast sessions?
Yeah, well, first to pick up the point you made, I didn't mean it by way of bragging rights, because I think I was at about podcast 18 in the middle of the pandemic, the start of the pandemic, and I thought of giving up. I just thought, I can't afford to do all this, the time, and I had someone who I was paying to prepare it all for me. So I thought I'd just stop. But actually, Mike Still, who's a lovely guy who listens to these podcasts and very supportive, said, Jonathan, don't give up. He said, these are really good. The people you get are fascinating. Keep it going. Honestly, keep going. Just, it's about stamina. A bit like doing an MBA or a PhD. It's not more than just stamina, just keeping going. And a consistent, as you're doing, you and I consistently, everybody knows that on the Monday evening, a little LinkedIn note comes in with a sort of top tip, and then the podcast will come out Tuesday morning, consistently for 300 episodes.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because actually I get exactly the same feedback, at a similar sort of point. So I was talking to a guy at the weekend, who's a good friend of mine, who said, this is great. You've got to keep doing it. It's fantastic. And and what's also interesting is watching on the sort of host site, clearly you've got some diehards who mine drops on a 12 p.m. and a midday on a Sunday. And they're clearly on a Sunday. I see this big spike as people download them, and then obviously across the week it's variable, but it's very consistent. The kind of the download pattern, which is really quite interesting. But yeah, I totally get that. I think it is about persistence. It's about and hoping eventually, obviously, you get to a point where it tips into a much bigger deal with a bigger listenership and all the rest of it. From my point of view, and I know that's where you've got to, which is where I'm aiming with it.
But that's an interesting point. A lot of people go for numbers and likes, and I've got this many followers and things. I'm just happy to make a difference to the few people who listen to.
Yeah. Totally.
And actually, at my stage of life, I'm not so worried about being having millions of people following it. It's about the quality that someone takes away from a tip from you or from me or from somebody else, and they go, "I'm going to go and use that. That's really useful. That helps me right now." But in answer to your question, sort of learning. Well, firstly, I think I said before, early adopter. So when people say to me, this is a book I'd recommend to your listeners, I go, great, I've listened to it, or I'm going to listen to it. So I do. That, as I say, has widened, broadened, deepened my knowledge. What was that famous saying that the average in America and the UK, this is a truism, the average person listens to one non-fiction book a year. That's average. So if I listen to 3 on a particular topic, I'm an expert. And I've got a lovely guy who's a CIA hostage negotiator. He's coming up. Fascinating guy. He's taken that into business now. Or, Scott Parazinski, who was a NASA astronaut, who's now the CEO of a technology company. Or Derek Redmond, who was the 800-meter sprinter whose hamstring snapped just as he was about to do really well in one of the Olympic races. And his father helped him hobble and make it all the way to the finish line when everybody was trying to stop it.
Yeah.
So meeting those kind of people, deeply touching. Meeting my sort of favorite author, Stephen Covey, and spending time with him, interviewing him, or Richard Dannett, my old commanding officer. I'd love to have John Stoker and John Griffin on, but they both are very humble. And one has got some bad experiences against the IRA, and the other one was in the SAS, and they just don't want to talk about those kind of experiences. A lot of my friends in the SAS, particularly now that they're investigating some deaths of IRA terrorists again in Northern Ireland, years later, they've had to go take their podcasts down, come off the internet because they're under threat. So there's some really interesting people. So 300 podcast guests so far, 100,000 plus hours of coaching different leaders. They say 10,000 hours of purposeful practice, you become really good at it. I think now with over 100,000 hours, I've forgotten more than I've remembered. I've sort of learned a lot of things, and I keep learning and refreshing. So I never say stuck with the same thing. I find a new guest will make me think about, like I had Oscar Trimboli, who, is an expert on listening. And that you listen at 5 levels. You listen to yourself as you're listening. You listen for content. You listen for context. You listen to the unsaid, and you listen for meaning. So little things like that because I'm auditory and visual, I pick those things up and use them. I also get a sense of perspective. For example, there was a wonderful guy who was a US Special Forces Marine, and he was on recently, and just the horrors of what he went through in kicking doors down in Iraq and having to be the first man in there as I think a major or lieutenant colonel, because the Iraqis wouldn't go through the door first. So he had to do that. So that's it. Getting perspective and appreciating the life I have. Then I think what I've learned from this is what is world-class. When I meet someone who comes across as a world-class CEO or a military man, you sort of know it, you sense it. And it's not the ones who are the most famous. Sometimes they're a bit too full of themselves. It's the ones you're just left with a deep impact on you. And I've also made friends with people who I have never met. They're fellow coaches like you, but they become lifelong friends. I've got one guy, Jeff Nischwitz in America, Florida. He and I co-coach each other each month. And even the relationship with Stephen Covey, we've become close friends now. So that's great. And then referrals. These people know other inspiring leaders, and they refer them on. And they say, you should be my guest on Jonathan's podcast. And so I get to meet people I would never otherwise meet because I'm curious about people's life stories. If you're not really interested in people, doing a podcast where you interview people is awful. And you've heard them. There's a lot of podcasts. I mean, there's over 3 million podcasts. Mine is rated in the top 1.5% of podcasts in the world. But that's, there's a whole load more that are much more famous. But you've got to be genuinely interested in people's stories. And then I think finally, it's taught me to let go of ego, judgment, and attachment to a viewpoint or something. It's a battle. It's a long-term battle. Ego pops up occasionally and I tell you how wonderful I am, or all these things I've achieved, or whatever it might be. Or I might be judgmental about somebody. I'm sorry, Boris, I'm judgmental about you, or Donald. I shouldn't have been so. I should be more understanding. But then, to be in a place of non-attachment, just notice things and be curious. But I had one guest who offered me a politician who'd been, in the news a lot, but I really just didn't trust his integrity. He was really quite duplicitous. It was quite public what he'd done. And he'd also been a bit unpleasant to people. And I just went, I don't want him as a recommended guest on there. So I have to be quite selective. I have a lot of agencies come and approach me. I've got this great person and I've got a criteria now. So I have a criteria and I send it back to them and say, it's a no from me because of this criteria. And that makes it so easy. Do they fit my criteria? Do they not? And if not, then I say no. Does that help? Oh.
Yeah, it does. Really, really, really interesting. And I think we're all like a bit judgmental. We all have a bit of ego as well. And sometimes, of course, it's unintentional on the ego thing, isn't it? If you've done a lot of stuff, I mean, I find some of the time when I do, the classic for me is you'll be sitting in a room full of people at a conference or whatever, and we'll do a round of introductions, just, tell us what you've done. And I'll kind of reel off some of the stuff I've done. And then people sit there and go, oh my God, and I've had several people, it's always quite amusing actually when people say, bloody glad you went after me. But it's
Bob,
not intentional.
You're a fast jet pilot. It's very hard to be humble when you're a fast jet pilot.
This is true. There is a bit of
one
that.
of the gods.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because I never set out to do that, but occasionally you do have to sort of think, right, I need to row this back, otherwise it will look too arrogant, too much, whatever. And I think that's true for quite a lot of people.
Yeah, you've got to be careful not to go to the other extreme. My brother, who was, as I say, was the president of the British Plastic Surgeons and a very loved and respected surgeon until he retired after he was attacked. He when he meets people on a train and they go, so what do you do? And he goes, I'm in the civil service. They go, oh, all right.
Yeah,
which he was.
Yeah.
He was in the civil service. Just it was a different part. It was the NHS. But he really doesn't want to tell them that he's a head and neck cancer surgeon. He's like, oh, I've got this lump here. Can you have a look at this? Or they start dropping their trousers. No, it's okay. That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny, because the other thing I find, if people say that to me, and what do you do? And I sort of start with what I'm doing now, but then I'll go, I was in the Air Force for quite a long time. And of course, the immediate response you get from people when you say that is, oh, were you a pilot? And I'm extremely glad I was a pilot, because I always feel very sorry for people who weren't pilots. You say that because it's a team game. I mean, the pilots only succeed in what they do because of everyone else that's involved. If it's a multi-crew airplane, or if it's the engineering team, or the air traffic controllers, or the supply officers, or the administrators, the whole shooting match all comes together to make it actually work. And that must be so annoying if you're not a pilot.
Yeah,
to constantly be, no, actually, I wasn't. I was an engineer.
The adverts when I grew up as a young man, there was this phalanx of people, this triangle, and at the front of it was a pilot, and at the back was his aircraft, and it said, "We support him." And of course, it's inbred in you, and then you go, no, hang on, you got Bob. We need to do the course on humility. Here, tell them about the people who you work with, and you're one big team. Oh yes, we're one big team.
It is true. It's very true. It's funny but fair. Who's top of your guest list that you've not had yet? Who have you on your number one wish list?
No, I mean there's a few up there. I'll share a few. Dalai Lama. I'd love to have the Dalai Lama for his groundedness and his spiritual presence. President Barack Obama. I think gravitas and presence. I'd love to hear some of his wisdom experience. As a fellow dyslexic, Sir Richard Branson, and just all the different things he's done, quite a character is. The explorer side of me, and the one who likes to do crazy things, would love Sir Ranulph Fiennes. I think he'd be great. I've read his book. I recently read Walter Isaacson's book on the bizarre Elon Musk. It would be quite fun to have a chat with Elon. And then I'm always a big royalist, both their strengths and the weakness. So either Harry or William would be quite fun to have on. Those are the people I'd enjoy.
You're probably not going to get them at the same time at the moment, that's for sure. But sadly.
No. Yeah.
No, that's a great list. I have to say, interestingly, I mean, I would have a lot of similar names on the list as well, because I think you've named a number of people there that I think would be fascinating to get their insights and their perspectives. As just before we move into the kind of highs and lows section, if you were looking back right to the beginning now and you were saying school-age Jonathan, what would you be saying to school-age Jonathan in terms of advice, given all you know now?
Yeah, interesting one. I think I would say don't be so intense. I think there was this upbringing, this expectation on me to be a general. And so I was a man in a hurry. And I think it made me too intense and too competitive and comparative with my peer group, just to relax a bit. Richard Dannett said this to me: Jonathan, you've got time. Just don't be too intense. Now, he is by nature very intense, but in a relaxed, calmer way of doing it. And so that there's, in some ways, Army officers and RAF officers, certain ones of them sort of cultivate this, just sort of showed up and climbed this hill. What was it called? Oh, Everest, apparently. It's nothing really, there can be the overdone bit. But I remember doing the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon, where I do still hold the world record for that. That's something I'm very proud of. And but Tom Ryle, who's now a CEO, Tom ended up just said, big drinking bout the night before, and he said, what's this walkabout thing? I'll come and run up the mountain with you. And he ran for about 8 hours with me up this mountain. Well, not 8 hours, but it was sort of 4 up and 4 down, and end up in the SAS at the end. There's sort of this understatement. So I think to be able to do it with a little bit of ease, but yet still have the drive. And then I think get out there and listen to audiobooks and podcasts, because broadening and deepening your knowledge about all sorts of different experiences is key.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think, interestingly, I wish I'd done history. When I was at school, you sort of elected at one point before O-level to do either history or geography, and I went down the geography route. And I wish I'd done history, not because I wanted to become some really deep historian, but just for exactly that reason, just to broaden your knowledge and about all sorts of things that actually are really important. And reading, I read quite a lot and always have read quite a lot, but I've not necessarily always read the right things at the right time. And audiobooks like you, I love audiobooks now. I think it's a fantastic way of when you're out walking the dog, driving the car, those sorts of things. Actually, I find them, audiobooks are and podcasts are great in those kind of environments. They work really, really well. So we're going to go back into highs and lows. When you look back across your whole career, what do you wish you'd done differently?
Oh, wow. Well, it's a funny one. I've made many mistakes along the way, but I wouldn't be where I'm at now, which is really this place of contentment. And happiness is wanting what you already have, rather than success is getting what you want. And so I am actually very contented and very happy now, and I'm living my life on purpose, and I'm living my dream with, the love of my life, Lee. I've got 4 children, got 2 rambunctious dogs who are just here in the room with me having fun. And so I am, in some ways, I wouldn't want to not have some of the experience, but there are some experience I wish I hadn't done. One is I got defrauded by a lady called Sasha Morris, who's now in jail, to invest in properties, originally a flat in the UK, but then she persuaded me to invest in Cyprus. And the one flat that I was going to get turned into 8. Then I got involved with a property fraudster. It spiraled on to lose over £300,000 over 10 years. Put immense strain, I think, on my first marriage. I mentioned already about being less intense when I was in the military. Though, funny enough, I wish I'd gone for SAS selection. Whether I got in, I don't know. I got through airborne selection, and so I knew I was sort of fit enough. I was probably my frame was a bit light for some of that, the heavy carrying over the Brecon beacons and that sort of resilience you need. But I love the navigation. I love the orienteering, the mountains, but it so happened just as I had the officer selection week in the diary. Then another friend of mine in Special Forces, who'd been undercover in Ireland, Nick Metcalf, he was driving myself and 2 of my friends from Yorkshire, and a hopper bus pulled out and we smashed into the side of it. And I ended up with a pneumothorax, collapsed lung, and back problems just before I was going to do it. And so I didn't get around to doing that one. And then I let it go. Life happened. I wonder if I'd done it. But then I've had so many friends of mine who went and did it, but are very traumatized by the PTSD. And they saw, and you and I were talking about some of the really tough situations the SAS have had to be in Iraq, in Afghanistan, other places with Colombian drug barons. So I probably, in some cases, if I hadn't invested in Cyprus, what would I have done with the money? I don't know. But I'm certainly pleased with, my 10 years in the Royal Signals, my 10 years in the Green Howards, my time in all these different companies from PricewaterhouseCoopers to IBM to the different leaders I'd worked with. But I think probably could have handled my first divorce better. I wish I'd handled that better. But we're now, my ex-wife and I, we met at our daughter's weddings, which were this year, and that all went terribly well. And we're very civil with each other and that. But it's always hard. Anybody going through a divorce, it's not. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It really is so tough. So those are some of the things.
Got one of those T-shirts. So I completely understand that. It is a very difficult time for sure. No matter how well prepared you think you are mentally for it, and that's hard. No, it's an interesting list. I mean, reflecting on your SAS selection point, I mean, I was just thinking. In fact, I did on the podcast I've just put out this week, which is just a personal stories one, where I've been doing some about my kind of journey through the training system into operational flying and those sorts of things. I had a moment back in, it was 1988, I think, when it actually happened, that I had to make a choice between going on an exchange tour to go and fly for the German Air Force or going on the qualified weapons instructor course, which would have meant going and becoming a weapons instructor that would have taken me to one of the Jaguar squadrons back at Coltschul from Germany, where I was at the time. And and I chose to go down the exchange tour route, which was great, and lots of good stuff came from that. But of course, in 1990, the Gulf War happened, and all the guys I had worked with, for years in terms of building up capability, disappeared off to go and do the Gulf War. And the Germans, for all very good, sound reasons for Germany, were not involved in that at all. So, we watched from afar while this all happened. And I've often reflected on, of the one thing really where it's been a big moment for me, where I talked about forks in the road, that I try not to have regrets, and I want to stick with my course. That's the one where I've kind of gone, but life could have been quite different if I'd gone and done that, I think, in terms of where, the direction of travel and stuff that I would have done and so on. So it is, it's really interesting to have those kind of reflection points, isn't it? What about positives though? What would you consider as your most important achievement for you so far personally? And you mentioned the legacy word when you were talking about your compass earlier. Where do you want to end up in legacy terms?
I think the first one I'd always begin with is family. I'm really proud to be a father to two lovely daughters who are now married and hopefully will have their own children. I've got two lovely stepchildren and their partners and grandchildren. I think a great achievement is meeting and marrying Lee, my wife. She really does sort of complete me. I feel a better man because of having met her and spending my time with her. I do want to grow old disgracefully with her, and love our time together. So I think that's family is always going to be a legacy, a stewardship, having the right life partner. As far as in my sort of sporting prowess, I think the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon world record, I still feel massively proud of that, and can remember to this day running down the dirt track into Episcopi with the Scots Guards pipers playing along the thing, and the commanding officer in the helicopter going, "Come on, Jonathan, come on, the Scots Guards." And there was, the battalion and all the locals with the finish line of the Cyprus walkabout cheering us on, lifting me onto their shoulders and carrying me into the sergeant's mess to pour beer down my throat at the end of it. And I just never forget that. That was 1985. I mean, it was years ago, but it seems like today. I suppose meeting Her Majesty the Queen and getting the MBE, just her charisma, no, not charisma, her inspiration. She is a truly inspiring leader. She's no longer alive, obviously, but I will never forget my 90 seconds with her when she seemed to know all about me without any earpiece or briefing notes or reading us from a script. That was very impressive. Very proud to have passed airborne selection for the Paras. And afterwards meeting General Howlett, Edge of the Sword fame, who very kindly offered me a place in 3 Para, which I was trying to join the Paras that time. But then I got cold feet, and I thought, post-Falklands, it's like a year or 2 after the Falklands. And I went for a night out in Aldershot. And that was enough to put me off forever, because I just saw how the soldiers and the officers behaved in Aldershot in this rather brutal, brutish way. And it was heavy machismo and violence. And I thought, that's not what I want. I don't want the Scots Guards on one end, because they offered me a place in the 2nd Battalion when I was a platoon commander there, because I'm not landed aristocracy, and my friend had castles and landed grouse moors. So I wasn't that, but I wasn't at the massively violent end of the scale, particularly just post-Falklands. 3 Para was a very corporal-led kind of organization. So I sort of found this place in the middle, which was the Green Howards. But very, very proud to have done airborne selection. I think achievements, I will look back that I have touched the lives of thousands of individual people and their teams in one-on-one coaching and in just asking great questions, which really make them think, and keep the ownership with them, or sharing tips and techniques through the podcast. That I think my legacy to be inspiring leadership, that I want to inspire leadership in other people. And that was the moment when I met my father's pilots, where one of them said, you could have a calling. You could go out there, meet interesting men and women like you and others, learn from them, and pass on those tips of being an inspiring leader to other people. That could be your legacy. And I've made that my legacy, and that is my legacy. So if I die tomorrow, I know I've touched the lives of many people, but mostly the way I've been as a father and as a husband to Lee. Yeah.
No, that's a great set of issues. I think it's very interesting on your world record one. When I did that German exchange tour I was mentioning a minute ago, the doctor that looked after the aircrew on at that time, his wife was a runner, and she had won the 800 meters gold medal at the Olympics in 1972 for Germany and broke the world record. She was the first woman to run under 2 minutes for the 800 meters. And it was fascinating. I was around at dinner at their house one night, and she had a picture, obviously a press sort of broadcast picture taken of them all coming off the final bend. And bear in mind, this was in I think I'd finished the tour, I'd gone back to Germany subsequently after this, so it was like 1993 or something. Mm-hmm. And so 20 years later, because she did this in 1972, and she could relive every second of, she talked through the journey from that final bend to the finish line. And so I think those kind of things, if you've had those sort of moments, you never forget.
Yeah.
You're going to be, it's going to be crystal clear. What, for every high, there's a low. What's your career kind of low point, and what did you learn from it?
I think with that intensity that I wanted to, live my mother's wish of becoming a general, going to staff college was very important. Came out in the top 10% of my generation, which was a great accolade. Got a chief of staff of a brigade. But I, somewhere along the line, sort of blotted my copybook, or I think I found out years later when I was at Sandhurst, the deputy commandant, who I never met, I don't remember meeting him. Anyway, he'd put in my report that he questioned my judgment. Now, as an officer, questioning your judgment is like death. Like, end this man's career now. Now, I was going through, my first marriage was struggling a bit. We just newly married. I wasn't a brilliant officer at Sandhurst as an instructor. My peer group went on to become generals and joined the SAS and things like that. And I'd been selected by the Royal Signals to be their person there. But I don't think I deserved to be just like chopped off below the legs without knowing it. I would love to have been brought in and had a briefing that, look, you made this decision and we really questioned the judgment you had over the way you selected or got rid of certain cadets. That would be useful, but I never knew it until years later when I look back and I then see that they said, promote in his turn. Well, that's going to be ages, isn't it? It's promote immediately, promote the next opportunity or whatever it is. But I didn't get promoted to lieutenant colonel at the first opportunity or the second. And at the third, I sort of realized, look, you're eventually maybe going to become lieutenant colonel, maybe a colonel, maybe a brigadier if you really work hard. But by then I'd realized I could tell the wind had changed. Something, was going on. And I probably wouldn't command my battalion, the Green Howards, because they had their sort of favorites. And so really, that's when I did the MBA. Even before I did the first opportunity, before the first opportunity, I'd done the MBA, and I thought I need to go out into industry. So it was a low point, but yet it forced me to reappraise: is this for me? I mean, I loved the military for 20 years, and I was pretty good at it, and got some amazing jobs and roles, and kept getting selected for great jobs. But for the future, there were people who were destined to make the top jobs. And my generation at Staff College have gone on to do some amazing jobs. I've interviewed a number of them, from just Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe to lots of 4-star generals and very successful people. So while that was hard at the time, it made me just completely, from a blinkered look at the army, got to be, push on, become a general. I realized there's a whole world out there. I mean, there's only 70,000 people in the army now. It's tiny. I mean, there's more people in Hezbollah than there are in the British Army. Just like it's so insignificant in the scheme of business and life. So there's a whole world out there, and I need to go out and reskill. And it was a blessing for me. So I think a low point turned out to be the kindest thing they could have done for me. So some brigadier, thank you for shafting my career, because actually I've gone on and I've found my calling, and that wasn't my calling. It was something I was okay at. I was pretty good, but I was put on the planet to do what I'm doing now and have these podcasts like we're having now.
Yeah, it's great. That's a great answer. And I think, as you say, making triumph through adversity and all that from that. I remember well that confidential reporting time when you didn't get to know what someone had written about you, and they could tell you whatever they liked, and they'd actually written something completely different. It was very, very frustrating. I feel for you. It's a challenge. Hey, I'm very conscious of your time, but there's a couple of questions I always ask that I want to get to, but there's one I just want to get a quick answer out of you first, because with all the experience you've got, where do you think the kind of greatest opportunities lie in terms of improvements of individual or collective leadership development for the private sector predominantly, but applicable across the world? Because I have some views on this, but I'd be really interested in your take.
Yeah, that's a great question and needs some quite deep thinking. If asked just initially to think about this, I think there has been this shift from working from home and office optional, as one of my guests called it. He wrote a book about it. He never had an office ever. They just come together at different times. So I think it requires a different way of leading and getting people together. But you do need them to come together at times, but not every week for 4 days a week in the office, which is what the command and control kind of leaders, they're trying to control people or put spyware on their laptops to work out how often they're working. I mean, goodness me, what's going on? So I think that this whole thing about the Edelman Trust Index is a measure of trust in different organizations, and over the years it's diminished everywhere. So I think we're going to have to revisit this whole area of trust. Then I think there's AI and reskilling, because I do think in the whole leadership area, AI will help to sort out a lot of things around psychometrics and kind of person you are, the kind of roles that you should be in. You're going to have to reskill, because a lot of these jobs won't require the kind of grunt work that's been done before, and a whole profession built around being knowledgeable about medical matters or legal matters which an AI machine will know way more than you and all the latest information. So working alongside AI to be an interpreter of it and asking it the right clever questions. I do think we have got a world which is full of this age of the strong man. And whether it be Netanyahu or Trump coming back in or Xi Jinping or Putin or whatever it is, that I think that's creating the same kind of people try to do that in business as well. Strongman leadership, which I don't think is the answer at all. And geopolitics and a potential World War III, I think, we'll sit in some 5 years from now and look back and go, hey, Bob, do you remember we did that podcast when things were all calm and quiet before the war? I
hope we're still able to do it after the war.
Who's to know? But I think the final thing is that the whole area of inspiring leadership and developing great leaders, which you and I are so keen on, I think is more important than ever. And you can't make a cost savings and cut out inspiring leaders. You need it at all levels, and people, that leadership is a choice that people make to be an inspiring leader, and everybody can be if they're prepared to. They have the right character and they're prepared to work hard enough to learn the skills. Unless they're manipulative and deceitful, when they're never going to be inspiring leaders, they're going to be misleaders. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, really interesting. We could have a whole podcast just on this. I'm sure maybe that's a good idea for some point in the future. But just to tick two little boxes that I like to tick. What's the most memorable event of your career so far?
My career, I think, was after the helping train up the Australians. I took a brigade headquarters. We made up, in addition to 15 brigade, I was the chief of staff, a mixture of 120 officers and men and women from around the UK to go to Australia and train the Australians for the East Timor operation to stop the militias who were massacring and raping and murdering. And because that went so well, I went to see Queen Elizabeth in the palace and get the MBE. And that was something I'll never forget.
Yeah, that's a pretty memorable event, that's for sure. I can completely accept that. And the final question is, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked? Great question for a coach.
Well, two thoughts come to mind. The first one is my 3-year-old granddaughter of my stepson, Daniel, and Grace would ask, Papa, why? Papa, why? And I'll explain why. And then she'd go, why? And like, Papa, why? And so it's like the 7 whys, but yet 20 of them. So that's the first thought, getting asked by a small person why things are as they are, and having to explain the way that they can understand without saying, because it's so, is important. The second one was when I met General Harry Langfield, and Harry selected people from McKinsey, and I was very interested in joining McKinsey just after I left. Deep respect for the organization. And I said, look, I only came to ask your advice, but about just going into business before I leave the army. And he said, no, I think you should go. I think you've got a great profile here. You should go for McKinsey. And I got through about 7 interviews, but then I got to the famous McKinsey mental maths question. Now, suffering from dyslexia and a thing called dyscalculia, when you're asked, Tesco last year made 89.28 billion or whatever they did. This year they're going to make 13% less. How much is that? And I went, God. Can I have a calculator? And they went, no, do it in your head. Do it in your head. Come on, do it in your head. And I go, no, I can't answer that question. I just, my brain doesn't work that way. So I think that meant I didn't get into McKinsey. But at the same time, I was also having the interview for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And the partner asked me, so Jonathan, what would happen if McKinsey offer you twice as much as us? And I said, that was a great question. And I said, great question. I said, I'd feel disappointed with you. And she went, I like that answer. You're in. And so actually, while I didn't get into McKinsey's, which I only learned later on that I had to do that mental maths test and to get it, I did get a lovely place in PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that was the making of me in business. So, great difficult questions lead to selection in another direction.
Nice. Yeah, it's a really good closeout. So, Jonathan, I knew it would be a great interview because I loved it when I was on your podcast, and it's been an absolute privilege to have you back on this one. Thank you very, very much indeed for some fantastic insights. Really appreciate it.
Well, Bob, thank you, and you do a great podcast. Keep it going. You've got a lovely curiosity and some wonderful questions. So, thank you for having me on.
Terrific. Thanks a lot.